Romans chapter 14, verses 1 through 10 for our reading. Him that is weak in the faith receive ye, but not to doubtful disputation. For one believeth that he may eat all things, another, who is weak, eateth herbs. Let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not, and let not him that eateth not judge him that eateth, for God hath received him. Who art thou that judgest another man's servant? To his own master he standeth or falleth. Yea, he shall be holden up, for God is able to make him stand. One man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. He that regardeth the day regardeth it unto the Lord, and he that regardeth not the day, to the Lord he doth not regard it. He that eateth, eateth to the Lord, for he giveth God thanks. And he that eateth not, to the Lord he eateth not, and giveth God thanks. For none of us liveth to himself, and no man dieth to himself. For whether we live unto the Lord. Whether we die unto the Lord. Whether we live, therefore, or die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ both died and rose and revived, that he might be Lord both of the dead and the living. But why dost thou judge thy brother? Or why dost thou set at naught thy brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. This is part of the practical section of the book of Romans. The practical section, we see why it's called that. What more practical instruction could we ask for than what we have here in the verses that we've read? This subject, you recognize some would eat certain things, some would not. We know that there were Jewish brethren that would not eat of the things that were forbidden under the Mosaic law. And they would not eat meat that had been offered in the idol temples, though they could buy it in the shambles there, they could buy it in the marketplace. But they would rather eat herbs totally than to take a chance on getting some meat that had been offered. Well, you know what the Apostle Paul says about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. He declares an idol is nothing at all. Certainly it's no God. And therefore, the meat that's been offered there is perfectly good to eat. And we should not have a problem with that. But he said, if it's going to offend my brother, then I'll not eat it. So long as the world stands, I will eat only herbs. I will do whatever in order not to offend my brother. Well, that's the same kind of situation we have here. We have Paul deal with this subject in the book of Galatians, for example, where he warns against it because the Judaizing teachers there were actually teaching, bringing people back under the ceremonies of the law, probably dietary laws and other things, and requiring this for salvation. All of that Paul would stand strongly against, as we've been seeing in our study in the book of Galatians. That cannot stand. Whatever the heart of the one receiving it might be, if those teachers were instructing the believers that they needed to do this in order to have salvation, that could not stand. And he called that another gospel and forbade the preaching of it. We know in the book of Hebrews you find the same thing. He tells them to go on beyond the rudiments of the world, to go on and advance and not to go back to those elementary things. That law that was a schoolmaster to bring them to Christ, once it's brought them to Christ, then leave it behind and go on and grow in grace. Colossians chapter 2, we find the same thing, that he absolutely forbids the observance of these kinds of things, of observing certain days and eating certain foods and not eating certain foods as rituals that were necessary to salvation, that would actually detract from the gospel and give people false hopes. But that's not what the context here is about. I do think, personally, that he's speaking to the same people. I mean that those that probably were more involved in abstaining from certain foods and those that were involved in observing certain days were probably Jewish brethren. And they didn't want to turn loose of those things. They thought there was still good in these observances, and they wanted to hold on to them, but they were not trusting them for their salvation. But then there were stronger brethren, and I believe that's accurate to say, the stronger brethren knew that these things had been nailed to the cross of Christ, that they no longer have any bearing on us, and they were stronger in that they were better informed and understood more what Christ had done when he nailed the handwriting of ordinances was nailed to his cross. Listen to what we have in Colossians chapter 2. He says, "You being dead in your sins and the uncircumcision of your flesh, hath he quickened together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross." All of those ordinances and the dietary laws and all those things, as he goes on to explain, they've been put away. Christ has fulfilled all of that, and therefore we do not need to observe those things anymore. We know that the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15 was held for the very same reason. There were Judaizing teachers that went out actually from the church at Jerusalem, apparently, and they were following the apostles around and going from place to place, teaching that they needed to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses in order to be saved. That was the very issue. That was why the Jerusalem Council was called and held. And they put forth a statement that was delivered to all the churches, that it was not necessary, and they were not to teach that one needed to be circumcised to be saved or to keep the law of Moses. They did give some concessions of the eating of things strangled and all of this, but he did not. This has nothing to do with salvation, and to teach that it does is a serious error, and Paul would not stand for it. But you don't hear that tone here, do you? You don't hear him denouncing these that are refusing to eat certain things and that are observing certain days. No, it's just the opposite. He's saying to those that disagreed with them, he's saying, have a charitable spirit toward them. They're brethren. In other cases, he would not have called them brethren, because if they were trusting to these things for their salvation, they weren't brethren. Paul knew something about these things. He had been quite the ritualist himself. Touching the law, he was blameless. He could have bragged in his days, the Pharisee. But this is practical in that, not that we are concerned with that particular subject of eating or not eating. All things are clean to us if they're received with thanksgiving. If it's not received with thanksgiving, it isn't clean, whatever it is. But we know that what the information that Peter received in Acts chapter 10, that there was nothing that was forbidden to be eaten if it were received with thanksgiving. And so those old dietary laws were put away, and they were nailed to the cross along with the other ordinances of that system. Now, in the previous chapter, let me complete the thought. there's a principle here. We're not necessarily concerned with those particulars, just like we may not be concerned with the particulars as to observance of certain days. We all agree that the Lord's Day is the Lord's Day. That's to be observed, and that's to be observed by all Christians, and that doesn't come into view here at all. When he says, when these that say you don't need to observe certain days, they were right. But all of them, both sides of this thing, they were all observing the Lord's Day, because that was set by the Lord Jesus Christ in his resurrection, and that's the day that the saints met. It's our Christian Sabbath, and that doesn't come into view here at all. But there's a principle set forth. There are things that are not essential. There are things that people dispute about in the church and get all lathered up when they're not essential things, when they're dealing with their own brethren. And sometimes this doubtful disputation, it's talking about a heated discussion, a heated dispute. And I suppose that this was happening here in the church at Rome. They had, we know, many Jewish converts there. They had many Gentiles. And there was a controversy, and I'll say again, I believe it was a Jew-Gentile situation for the most part. Though we're sure that the Gentiles, as well as Jews, many of them would have been considered the weaker brethren. And on both sides, among the Jews and the Gentiles, there would have been some who would be considered the stronger brethren. So, but nevertheless, the issue, I believe, is that same issue, but he deals with it in a totally different tone. And he sees these not as preaching a new gospel and undermining the foundations. He sees them as brethren. He sees them as weaker brethren that need to be encouraged. We are to those that are spiritual, James says, or not James, but Paul says in Galatians 6, those that are spiritual. They are to help those that are weaker brethren, those that are taken in sin or whatever. Not that only weaker brethren can be taken in sin. We know that that can happen to us all. But nevertheless, when one is in a state of weakness, those that are spiritual are to reach out to them and bear their burdens. And they're to do it in love, not with a vengeful, hateful disposition and attitude. And that is the very thing that I think Paul is talking about here. So this principle can apply in so many ways, in so many different areas in the church today. Things that we can dispute about that are not, they're just not essential things. Some are totally ridiculous. I've known of people that left a good church because they thought the temperature ought to be set at a higher degree than it was, and others were saying that it was too hot, and others saying it was too cold, and some of them just left the church. What in the world? Put on a sweater if it's too cold. But to have a dispute over it, to have nearly a church split over something so ridiculous as that, it doesn't make any sense. There's a principle here that we can disagree. We can have disagreements, but we do not have to be disagreeable. We can disagree with our brethren on many issues, but we do not hate them. We don't enter into heated debates about it. Whether it's Boaz's shoe that was cast behind or the other kinsman. We were talking about that at lunch today. And I haven't forgiven Steve yet. I think that sometimes there are those in the church that believe in homeschooling. Others send their children to the public schools. There's been great controversy over that. When in both cases, we're dealing with brethren. We're dealing with those for whom Christ died. We're dealing with those who God makes them to stand, as Paul says here. So this should not be. These things, as James said, ought not so to be. Never. When we disagree, and I say this, with the school system the way it is today, and I'm the son of a career educator. He taught at every level there was. He was even the county superintendent where we lived. And so he was an educator for 46 years. But I would not send my kids to public school. I would homeschool them. The schools today, and I suppose it's not quite as bad in our area as it is in some, but what is being taught in the public schools, the things that are being accepted, the children are going to school not learning the 3 R's. They're learning all about politics. They're learning about wokeism. They're learning about sex changes and all of those things. But anyone that disagrees with me on that, we can agree to disagree. Not going to fight about it. Not going to have a dispute about it. It should never be. Well, that was happening here in the church at Rome, and Paul is dealing with it. Now, the apostle in the previous chapter, you remember he was dealing with moral duties in general, our conduct toward each other and toward all, not just in the community of the church, but everyone, living peaceably under God's ordained magistrates, under the powers that be, living according to their laws and not being lawbreakers. We are to live peaceably where we can obey the laws and the powers that be. We are to do so. We're to pay to all men that one debt that we owe them. Love all. Owe no man anything, he said, but to love one another. That's the debt that we owe to all, in the church and out of the church, neighbors and wherever they are, whoever they are, we have that debt. Then, of course, the conducting of ourselves in godliness and sobriety, leaving the old deeds of darkness back there in the night. We've been delivered out of that darkness, and we have risen to a new day, an eternal day. And therefore, we're to leave those things behind. We're not to be involved in drunkenness and rioting and reveling and all the things that he lists there. And that is generally true with all. It's our duty, not just in the church, but in the community, in the world. Now he goes to address matters of conduct and attitude toward one another in the community of the church, in the Christian community. In this, he returns to his burden of chapter 12. You remember in chapter 12, it had to do with the body of Christ, members of the body, being congenial with one another, helpful to one another, fulfilling our role in the body. And he returns to that here in this chapter, to something similar to that. And there he admonished in that chapter to be of the same mind one toward another. Be of the same mind. But even then, we stated then that this does not imply agreement of view on all subjects. That would be a total impossibility. Where there are many minds, we're not all going to be in lockstep union and total agreement on everything. Just not going to happen. But yet he said, be of the same mind. How can he say it? Well, concerning the essentials, concerning the fundamentals, those things foundational to our faith, be of one mind. And certainly if we're not in one mind of those things, then we have problems. But what we now have before us is proof that that very fact is proven because of individual prejudices. These are not of the same mind concerning these matters, obviously. And there are individual prejudices and there are degrees of understanding that will guarantee that we're not going to be exactly the same mind on everything. There can and should be charity granted to such as are weaker in the faith. When he says that those are weak in the faith, there should be, and I know that scholars differ on this. Some believe that it should read weak in his faith or weak in faith. But I believe the article belongs there. I think he's talking about the system of doctrine, our faith. And those that are weak in the faith, that is, there are certain things that they have not grasped yet. There's certain light that they don't have yet. There are certain things that Christ put away that they're not aware of it yet. So it's matters concerning the faith. But either way, even if it's their faith, if they are weaker brethren, the same thing follows. Paul by no means is here departing from his strong statement in Galatians chapter 1, where he absolutely forbade any other gospel. And he's not talking about that here, as we've already pointed out. On those fundamental matters, all persons here referred to would be agreed. I'm convinced of that. Those that had a problem with eating certain things and those that were observing certain days, they might be disputing with their brethren over those things, but they were in agreement on the basics of the faith. They weren't trying to come up with a new gospel. They weren't trusting these things for their salvation. I can see that. I can understand how that if they observed these days and they enjoyed observing these days and they honored God in those days, how that they might want to continue doing that. And Paul said if they observe the day, they're doing it unto the Lord. And those that do not observe the day, they're not observing it unto the Lord. They're doing it because they think it's what the Lord would have them to do. So it's not like that they're some kind of renegade. It's that they are seeking to serve the Lord to the best of their knowledge, though obviously the knowledge of some is greater than that of others, but they are in the faith. But where the purity of the gospel was under attack, we know that Paul got pretty heated himself. Let him be anathema. Anybody, if I or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel, let him be accursed. That's pretty heated itself. But he's saying, no, don't dispute these things with that kind of vigor and that kind of zeal. So here we have an account of the hurtful tensions that existed in the church around the matters of meats and days. Meats and days. We see here in verse 2, let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not, and let not him that eateth not judge him that eateth, for God hath received him. Then in verse 5, one man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. He that regardeth the day regardeth it unto the Lord, and he that regardeth not the day, he doth not regard it to the Lord. These things he is acknowledging that in both cases they are seeking God's honor. They're seeking to honor the Lord. And I think that in itself should, if we disagree with someone and we don't believe that, for me, that wouldn't be to honor the Lord, for me to observe that. But we can't get into that person's heart and judge him. He feels that it does. And until he learns better, and in all of these things, he is not forbidding us to correct errors. That's not what he's talking about at all. We can instruct the weaker brethren. We can enlighten them. We can teach them things like Colossians chapter 2. We could take them there and teach them that. Well, they didn't have Colossians chapter 2 to turn to. So these were supposed to, as we would correct those that we believe are mistaken, if they do not receive our correction, then we're not to be in some heated dispute with them over it, or to let the words become harsh and hateful. They're our brethren. They belong to the Lord. God has accepted them, and he holds them in his hand. He supports them. So certainly we ought not to try to tear somebody down that God has accepted, that God is upholding. He says, God upholding them in their error? No, God is patient with them, and he will bring them to a better understanding, and he may use us to do it. But it's not very likely that if it's a heated thing that God's going to use that to correct anybody. We have a tendency to dig in a little deeper when that's the attitude. But there was disagreement among them about meats. These are the two things specified, that meats and days. But there were a disagreement among them about meats. Some felt that, and I believe that this is what they were talking about, some felt that the meat that was offered to idols should not be eaten. And I believe there may have been some still hanging on to some of the dietary laws, that pork should not be eaten, that swine meat should not be eaten, that they would stick to that which chewed the cud and parted the hoof in what they would eat. But it says that some of them were so adamant about it that they just ate herbs. They didn't eat any meat at all. I think that would be those who were fearful of even accidentally, unknowingly, buying meat that had come from the idol temple. And they felt that that would dishonor God to eat that. As I said before, in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul eliminates that God is not going to be offended by that. But to back up a little bit, if that person felt like that it was an offense to God to eat it, and he went ahead and ate it, thinking that it was an offense to God, that would be an offense to God. But if we teach them, if the wiser, if the stronger teach the weaker and persuade them, God is not offended by this, then you've won your brother and you continue in fellowship. But if it can't be done that way, then we're not to enter into doubtful disputation. Now, it's important to understand that there's a principle laid down here that must apply to other non-fundamental differences that we may have. The church at Rome was made up of both Gentiles and Jewish believers. It seems likely that Paul is addressing, at least in part, the same problem that he has addressed in these other places. But I think in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, for example, in that situation there, it's the same as here. Paul is considering these to be brothers. If eating meat that's been offered to idols, if it's going to offend my brother, then I'll not eat it. So it's the same here as it is in 1 Corinthians 8. We're dealing with brethren. In other places, you're dealing with heretics that are preaching another gospel, and that can't be allowed. But Jewish believers still had a problem with eating certain meats. They were not convinced yet that those dietary laws should be done away with. I've known of some, even in this 21st century, that feel that way. They feel like we still ought to observe those abstaining from the things that God told his people to abstain from. It could be that if people did, they might eat a healthier diet. I don't know. But certainly there's no requirement along that line as Christians. The Word of God does not require this of us. Our Lord does not require it. We know that for a fact. Now, some argue that the issue was not the same as 1 Corinthians 8. First, and one particular author that I particularly admire and benefit from, but have to disagree with him here. He argues that there is a distinction made here between Jew and Gentile, and I suppose that is correct. So there can be weaker brethren and stronger brethren on both sides of this of the nationality, on both sides of the Jew-Gentile thing, because he doesn't specify that the Jews were doing it, that the converted Jews were doing it. But secondly, he argues that the total herb diet was not a Jewish diet. That was Gentile. But as I said before, I think that there were those who were still had a conscience about those things, that just went to an all-herb diet rather than to chance it, rather than to risk inadvertently getting a hold of some meat been offered to an idol. I think that is the case here. It's not to do with the dietary laws. A third argument that he gives is that there were Gentile aesthetics as well as Jewish that were still involved in asceticism. And I suppose that's true under the Pythagorean philosophy. There were those Gentiles that might have, but I think that is kind of a stretch to bring that in here. But we can certainly assume that both Jews and Gentiles were among the weaker brethren. But these dietary matters surely seem Jewish to me. But let's not get into a dispute about that either. I guess that's one of those things we get into an argument about it. There was disagreement among them about days as well as foods. Some thought themselves still under the obligations of solemnizing certain days that were set aside under the ceremonial law. I imagine it would have been kind of hard to see Passover come and go for a Jewish convert and not do anything in observation of it, or the Feast of Pentecost come, or the Feast of Tabernacles, and some of the new moons and Sabbaths that they enjoyed, taking these days of rest and honoring God with these days. I think we can understand how that they might have still been sentimental about those things and still thought there was benefit in that, and maybe there was to their soul some benefit in that. But Paul recognizes that when they do, they're doing it unto the Lord. So he's not slapping them down for it. So why should we get into a heated argument with them over it when the Lord is not upset about it? They're doing it unto the Lord, and he seems to be receiving that as from the heart that it was sent from. Now, I think you know what I'm saying, and you wouldn't misunderstand. I'm not talking about heresies. I'm not talking about soul-damning things. I'm not talking about things that threaten the gospel. God would never receive it. He would never, ever condone it. Certainly he wouldn't receive it as worship. But in these cases, it appears from what Paul is saying that God does. He's very charitable with them. We have to understand it with, as I said before, as far as these days are concerned, and days that do not any longer need to be observed. Though some were observing them, they didn't need to. But the Lord's Day does not come into the picture, because on both sides of this, they were observing the Lord's Day. They were coming together on the first day of the week. That was established, and I guarantee you, there was no disagreement among the brethren here, whatever side they were on, about the Lord's Day. That was unanimously observed by Christians. Sadly, today, we must insist upon this. There are those who take this very passage and say, well, see there, some regard one day and others don't regard any day. They just, all days are the same. I've heard people talk about the Lord's Day that way, or the day that we would be able to meet. Well, you don't have to meet on the first day of the week. You can meet whatever day you want to. Every day is the same. That's being taught today. Now, I think anyone that teaches that is just simply ignorant of his Bible, or deliberately not paying attention to what is said. I've gone through the New Testament. I'm sure many of you have too. Every time that there is a day mentioned upon which they met, if the day is named, it's always the first day, without exception. Now, there are times when it says they met for the breaking of bread. It doesn't say what day it was. But any time the day is identified, it's always the first day. Paul was coming on the first day of the week to collect the offering for the saints at Jerusalem. He would be coming to these churches on the first day. Why? Because that's when they assembled. When John was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day on the Isle of Patmos, I'm quite sure it was the first day of the week. It was established. The pattern is there. And I don't believe that there should be any disagreement on that, but yet there is. So they had these disagreements about days. They had the disagreement about meats, and they were to be charitable with each other, whatever side they were on, and not get into heated discussions about it. I knew that was there somewhere. My third page, about to panic there. But here it's, to reiterate, it's not the difference of opinion that is the hurtful thing, but it's the way that they handled it. That's what was causing the tension. That's what was causing the hurt in the church, and that's why Paul is addressing it. And I say again, this practical section of the book of Romans, what could be more practical than this? Teaching us these things, how that we are to dwell together as brethren, understanding that we may have differences of opinion about things, but we can still dwell together in unity and still in love, even as we try to persuade others to our view or to what we believe the Bible teaches. We can do that. And sometimes it's very obvious who is right. And it's not wrong to persuade someone if they're in any kind of error, but it's the manner in which it is done. The strong ones here who knew the liberty that Christ had given concerning these things, they were despising the weaker ones, entering into heated disputes about it. It wasn't wrong to argue about it. It wasn't wrong to state your opinions. It wasn't wrong to point out where you thought your brother was wrong. What was wrong was the hateful tone. Hateful tone can turn good works into evil works. Love suffers long, it's kind. Now, the weak ones judged and censored the strong ones. It was a two-way street. They saw their use of liberty not as a strength. They didn't see them as stronger. They saw their use of the liberty that Christ gave them as carnality and looseness. The same basic problem is still with us today. On the one hand, some who are proud of their knowledge know nothing as they ought to know it. If their knowledge does not cause them to, in love, try to persuade with that knowledge, then they don't know anything as they ought to know it. But on the other hand, often those who are weaker would have everyone to think as they think. And if you don't agree with me on this, then we just don't have any fellowship. I can't speak to you. And we find that to be the case sometimes. But next we have, and I just have time to introduce this. We'll deal with this next time. But next we have suggestions laid out to correct the problem and prevent ill effects. For the remedy, the apostle lays out some simple rules of reason. The weak must be received, but not to doubtful disputation. Take this for a general rule. Spend your energy, spend your zeal in those things wherein all of the people of God are agreed, not disputing matters that are doubtful. Receive him, he says. Receive him, that is, take him to you. Receive him with great affection, not, as so often is the case, well, I love you, but you're a heretic. You know, some of the harshest things are said in love. I'm telling you this because I love you. But these are to be done in love. They're to be done when we persuade a brother or try to persuade a brother or sister. It's to be done in love. The Syriac reads, lend him your hand. If this is a weaker brother and you're going to try to help him, extend your hand. Reach out your hand to him, help him. Not to doubtful disputation, he says. Or as the margin reads, not to judge his doubtful thoughts. Again, not that we're not to correct wrong ideas, but not in some censorious, condemning, demeaning manner. We're to do it in love, and we're to do it with a heart to help our brother and not to harm him and not to leave him with a bad taste in his mouth. Then secondly, there must be a mutual consideration with both parties. We see in verse 3, let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not, and let not him that eateth not judge him that eateth, for God hath received him. The strong ones who knew the liberty that Christ gives, they were to consider their brethren in this way, in this light. But there has to be mutual consideration with both the parties. He says here, but God has received him. Here is a needful reminder when we are tempted to behave scornfully or to speak scornfully to any of the brethren. God has received him. This reminder should curb many an attack. This is the needful reminder. because God holds him up. Yea, he shall be holden up by God. Are we would we ever try to knock somebody down that God is holding up? Fight against God. Because God will make him stand. And I believe that as he stands in God, the implication is that he will come to the light. He'll come to the truth. God will bring him. God has a hold of him. And then we have, because they are servants and will answer to their own master in verse 4. Note the question, who art thou that judgest another man's servant? Both weak and strong Christians are our brethren, but they are not our servants. They're God's servants. I know in one sense we serve one another. Jesus said if you want to attain greatness in the kingdom, then you serve. You serve your brethren. Even the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, to serve. And in that regard, certainly we serve each other. But we get the point here, that we are God's servants. This is one that God owns, that he has owned and he holds up, and he will bring to the light, he will bring to the truth. Both the weak and the strong Christians are brethren. James says, be not many masters. And then the last thing here, because both, if true believers have an eye to God and to his approval. Verse 6, I've already been over that, will not repeat it. They do what they do unto the Lord. And if we cannot, and I'm not scolding anybody, I don't know that we have any problem along this line, but if we cannot consider that, if we can't cause that to temper any interaction that we would have with one who we believe to be in error, then certainly we need to realize that he serves and his service is received by God, as he puts it forth. Something else that we see here in verses 7 to 9, I'll just read this and we'll deal with it next time. A description we have here in verses 7, 8, and 9. We have a description of the true Christian taken from his end and aim. What is the end? Well, if you know what the end is, you know what his aim is. If you know what he's striving for, then you know what his actions are going to be. If you know what he's pressing for, then you know what his aim is. We have that in verses 7 and 8, and then the ground of that in verse 9. But we have a description of the true Christian taken from the end and the aim and the ground of his actions. Well, these are practical things, and we need to receive them to ourselves as practical, helpful instructions in our interaction with one another as brethren, and considering all who are a part of the body, considering all to be brethren and beloved.